can talk about values and perspectives, but sooner or later we have to get to legislation. And those of us who are involved in the immigration movement, what we want is immigration reform. What we want is the change in the legislation. So the question that we're going to be trying to sift through tonight is, can the Old Testament actually help us with this? Okay. And my answer to you, as you would well expect, is the answer is yes. Right? Otherwise, we would be having this lecture and we'd all go home and okay. So the answer is yes. Can it help us? The answer is yes. The question is how and with what. So what I'd like to do tonight, in the time that I have, is just begin to walk through this a little bit. And the first thing I want us to think through is the nature of law. Now, one of the things that I hear as I travel and speak is this American idea that in this country we have the rule of law. You may have heard that phrase. And we talked about this morning in colloquium. And actually, when I hear that, I can appreciate the sentiment. But it really hasn't told me anything. Because every country in the history of the world has had the rule of law. See? I can go to Guatemala, or I can go to Japan, or I can go to Ghana, and everyone has law. They have lawyers, and they have court systems, and they have jails, and they have streets with lines and signs and lights that go on and off. And then if someone robs a bank, there's penalties to be paid. Every country in the history of the world has had rule of law. So when they tell me that, they really haven't told me much. See, the question is not whether we have the rule of law or not, because that's kind of a non-starter. Everybody does. The question is, what kind of law do you have? And what are the values that drive the law? Now, when it comes to immigration legislation in this country and in many countries of the world, oftentimes immigration laws are laws about control. What do you do when they get in and how you control them? And then the other piece is whom you let in and whom you do not. So they're about control and exclusion and filtering. And so I'm going to suggest to you that even though you have to have some of that, of course, well, is that the driving force behind the law? And I would suggest to you that in the Old Testament it is not. And what we need to do is begin to think about what kind of values our laws reflect and how might they be reworked to empower those who are here to contribute to the common good. Now, what law does is that law organizes a society. So we all do this in every country. So what they'll do is they'll cover things like marriage, land acquisition, inheritance, crime, robbery, murder, rape. How you organize the streets. You see, and it's kind of funny because this is all pretty arbitrary. And I always use the example of traffic laws. Those are always easy. And so we drive on the right-hand side of the road. Now, I don't know who decided that, because in Britain, of course, you're on the other side. So, who's on the correct side, right? Well, the Brits have always been on the left, so probably the colonial, Americans go, we're going to go on the right side, because it's, let's just kind of, do the British thing, right? And so then we put stripes, and you got to know, the color of the lines, if they're white or if they're yellow, and if they're striped or if they're solid, or if there's a double yellow line. Then you've got to figure out, these different colored signs, if they're going to be yellow or red. And then you've got to figure out the shapes of the signs, whether they're going to be triangular or octagonal. And then you've got to understand the light colors, you see. Who decided that green meant go? I don't know. Or red means stop, right? And if you have to actually pass a test on this. And then they give you this plastic card, which gives you the right to drive on these streets, right? And if you don't do it correctly, they stop you with the flashing lights, and your heart starts beating very fast. And then they actually charge you fines for breaking these arbitrary laws about how fast you can go, and all these different things. Right? And of course, in Britain, it's all on the other side, right? And they'll have their signs, and their signs going to be roundish, right? And then other side of the road. And if you break those laws, of course, then there are, fines to be paid. Then in Guatemala, of course, it's very interesting too. Because we have stop signs, and those are helpful. Right? So you kind of see if anybody's coming, right? And you go through. A red light means, kind of double check. And we have lines in the streets just like here, and those are helpful, But when it's traffic time, economy of space. If we can kind of fit 5 into 3 lanes, that makes sense, right? Kind of a mathematical equation. It's kind of economy of space. Right? When you come out of Denver Seminary, there's a stoplight. And sometimes I have to teach at night. And so I come, it's like I'm leaving at like 9 o'clock at night. I come to the stoplight, and nobody's coming, right? And so I start getting these little voices in my head, right? The Guatemalan voice is going, "Vámonos," right? The American voice is, "They have cameras everywhere." Right? See, law organizes us. And every country in the world has always had the rule of law. Some of it's pretty arbitrary, and this is a cultural thing. This is why when you go overseas, you go through culture shock because you don't understand how the law works or what to do when you go into a government office. Do you take a bottle of wine for the guy behind the counter or not? Right? Or other things you might bring as kind of offerings to the god of the administration or something. You see, so you've got to figure this out and how to navigate this, right? So when we talk about the nature of law, it's a little more cultural than we tend to think. What we have to appreciate is that what law does, it helps, to shape us. And so this is why I say here, we have to appreciate the laws the values that shape the laws that also will shape our identity. So again, you see, are laws charitable or punitive? Are they empowering or controlling? Who gets to participate and who doesn't? And what happens is law will also begin to shape a mindset and an ethos of a society. So that's part of the things, if you're from another country, and some of you I know are, and you come here, you've got to figure out how this thing works and how people think. So when the policeman, comes up to you and stops you, it's your first impulse to reach for your wallet, not for your license, but an encouragement. An offering for coffee and donuts. You see? But if you come from overseas, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you can see how this works because, for instance, in Guatemala, you are guilty until proven innocent. Okay? Which is the opposite of here. So the last thing you want, if you have an accident, is for policemen to come. Because what they do is they take both cars away until they figure out, who's at fault. So you're both guilty until we figure out who's innocent. Now that creates a whole mindset, not only about how society functions, but also how you engage law. It wasn't until a few years ago that Guatemala had trial by jury. It was all done in judges' offices. And this is a very new concept, trial by jury. Part of the problem about decisions being made by judges in offices is that bills would make their way into the folders that would reach the judge's desk. You see. It shapes us. So even as we think about immigration law, what are the values that drive it? What does it say if one is American? What do the immigration laws say about this country and about its people? The third piece is that laws grow out of certain histories. And this is one of the reasons we won't do this tonight, except for a little bit later on, is what are the histories behind the laws? Why are the laws the way they are? In this country, for instance, immigration law, and most people don't know this, work by quota systems. Everything is numerically determined by the government. So people have to say, well, why don't they just do it right? You know, just kind of show up at the office and fill out the paperwork and you get your visa. Well, it doesn't work that way. Everything is under quotas, right? And so when the quota system is filled, boom, you're done. So our quota for unskilled labor in this country is in the tens of thousands. The need of the country is in the hundreds of thousands. See, there is no line that you can actually get into that works. If you are here undocumented, there is absolutely nothing you can do to get legal status. There's nothing. There is no line to get into at all. There is nothing under U.S. statutory law that gives any door to anyone here who is undocumented. Why? Where did that come from? What's the history behind that law that brought it to this point in time? And these kinds of things are the framework for how we even engage the law. Part of the problem in this country is people don't know the history or they've forgotten it. We'll see that in just a moment. The other thing that people will tell me or ask me is this. Well, this is Old Testament law. Good night. This is the 21st century. We're in the United States, right? And so why are you going to the Old Testament? Good theological question. Well, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, it says something, I think, very profound, because it says this. The nations that surround you will look at your laws, and they will say, oh, what wise laws you have, and what a great God you have. Now, what you're hearing there is this idea that the law is communicating a set of values. And these values, of course, reflect the character of God. So the laws don't transcend time, but the values behind the laws do. And that's what makes it something that we can go to and learn from. Now, I gave you a couple of verses here, and I think you had an outline maybe. These are not on the outline, the Genesis verses, because here you have, for instance, in the Genesis 18, an engagement with Abraham. This is even before the giving of the law. And if you look at the vocabulary carefully, what you're seeing, there's a connection between the law that will come with Moses and centuries before with Abraham. And so what you're seeing is that there's some underlying values that will percolate back into Old Testament law that actually go back much earlier. You see, these values transcend time. Now, what that tells me is something very important, because what it means is I don't have to imitate Old Testament law. That's not the point. In fact, it's a kind of silly thing, because we're looking at an ancient agrarian society. Why would I want to mimic Old Testament law? But if I want to ask what I can learn from the law, that's something else. So how those values will be incarnated in 21st century North America is very different than what it looked like in that other part of the world at that time. Very different than now. So let's begin the journey to try to see how this works. When you go to the Old Testament and you begin to think of, can I walk around? Can you pick me up on the camera? Like if I hide behind here or something, just to bother you. When I get tired, I get either grouchy or feisty. So I'm in the feisty mood tonight. So all right. You see, what happens is the ones who come from the outside are very vulnerable, and we're going to talk about why in just a moment. If we understand human history as the history of migration, because that's what it is, every country in the world is not what it was. The people have migrated at some point in time to that place, okay? And it just continues today. Now, we're seeing migration in numbers we've never seen before, but the phenomenon itself is it's from the beginning of time. Okay. Now, when you migrate, you're going to have certain things that make you vulnerable. And in ancient Israel, there would be at least two reasons why you'd be very vulnerable. And you can see these in your notes. In ancient Israel and in much of the Old Testament world, of course, you didn't have a welfare system. Now, in some cultures, what you had is the temple complex, which served as a bank in many cultures. But also what would happen is they would distribute foods and things like this. So the temples could serve a little bit as a safety net. But basically, in Old Testament law and in the ancient world, a lot of your help came through extended family. We know from archaeology that ancient Israel was primarily a peasant village state, with maybe 95% of the population living in these small villages of extended family of anywhere between maybe 80 to 120 people. So if you were sick and couldn't work the fields, someone could come alongside. If a woman was going to give childbirth, there would be other women that could come along. If someone would die, or a child would get sick, or in war, if a man would come back from the war without an eye or without a hand, there would be help in the extended family. The problem if you're an immigrant is what? That's the one thing you don't have, is extended family. So you're dependent upon the Israelites, for shelter and for protection and for food, and work. The other reason that you see there is this whole idea of owning land. If you're in a peasant economy, what you need to do is own land, because that's what you got to work. In ancient Israel, the land would come through, the families and through primarily the male. But what's the problem if you're from the outside? You're out of the system. So you're totally dependent on the Israelites, you see. You're vulnerable. Who do you turn to for work? When you're sick, somebody dies, something happens. You're dependent upon the Israelites. And we have this idea that a lot of these outsiders would have been day laborers. Now you see Jesus doing this in the Gospels, right? Talking about, in this parable, about different men waiting to get picked up for work. Well, you see that even today. But in the ancient world, of course, even more than now. So the question then becomes, how does Old Testament law respond to the needs of these vulnerable people? And I give you in your notes a list of things. Let me just mention these. We won't turn to the passages. You have them there. I'll just make some comments. The first thing is labor. Immigration is about labor. If you study immigration history and immigration law, it's about work. The push-pull, it's called in immigration circles. See, what pushes them out, oftentimes, is looking for work, or better jobs, or a better life. So that's pushing them out. But something has to pull them in, which is what? The availability of jobs. So in actuality, in this country, we've seen over the last few years, the number of people coming into this country is going down. Well, why do you think so? Well, look at the economy. And you also have an outflow as well of people going back. I know the church I go to, that's what happened, or is happening. Some families will actually move back because it's getting so hard to get jobs here, not only because of their availability, but because of the laws that are being passed that kind of squeeze them. Now, when you have immigrant labor, there's several things that occur. One thing is people take advantage of them. If you're in Metro Denver, where I live, and you go by a construction site, of homes, let's say, and people are working on Sundays, I can almost guarantee you that they're going to be Hispanic workers. Okay? Or if you're in the summer in Denver, in your Mile High, and they're putting, that kind of synthetic roof, which get blistering hot because it's coming right off, right, the tar, right off those rooftops that high up. So who's going to take those jobs? Immigrant labor. And here's the point. If you say, well, I can't work on Sunday, they say, fine. We got a line of people, actually, ready to work. So, if you don't want to work, that's fine, because someone else will take your place. And why do people hire immigrant labor? Because it's cheap. You don't have to pay them minimum wage. If they want to complain, who are they going to go to? So it's interesting when you go to the Old Testament law, what do they say? The first thing is it gives them rest. And I give you the Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. These are the Sabbath laws. And if you read the Sabbath law, you will see that, you'll work 6 days, and on the seventh day you will rest, you and your wife and your sons and your daughters and your manservants and your female servants and the sojourner who lives in your midst. See, because that's the human tendency, is to work them without rest. It also says in terms of wages, you will pay them a fair wage and you will pay them on time. Does that make sense in an immigrant world? Oh, you bet it does. Fair wage and on time. I have people that I know get paid in cash, and then they get told, well, if you come to this corner, at 5 o'clock on Thursday, we'll be there to pay you. And they show up, and what happens? Nobody's there. And so I'm talking to this one particular man who comes to mind, and I said, so what do you do? He says, well, there's nothing I can do. I just trust the Lord. I know he'll give us something else. This kind of use of immigrant labor, as you see, is nothing new. Earlier today, and it all runs together because they do work me so hard here. Look what happens in Egypt in Exodus chapter 1. I'll assume you know the story. What you have is foreign labor, the Israelites. And something happens that triggers Egyptian fear. And if you read the narrative, what triggers Egyptian fear is the numbers. Okay? What that number was, we don't know. But something triggered it. There was too many of them. And I was given the example, and I can't remember when I did it, but I did, and it wasn't this group, I don't think. And if it was, Matthew, just go, you've already done that. I was giving the story of being in Boston. Did I do that with this group? Is that somebody else? Really? Okay. Matthew's going. Okay. I'll give you a couple of examples. You go to Boston, and you come out of South Station, and you look to your left, and there's this sign that says Chinatown. And there's actually tour buses that go in there, because that's the best Chinese food in Boston, And no one is bothered that the signs are in Chinese. No one's bothered. Everyone's kind of talking Chinese. I think it's kind of cool, actually. And I was telling them, my younger son went to school close to Boston, so we also went one day and we did, along the museum and stuff. And then we walked over to the Italian part on the North Shore kind of thing. And I was telling them earlier, it's like walking into the set of The Sopranos. These guys are sitting on these white plastic chairs and these wife-beater T-shirts, and they're all kind of talking like this, And then you sit down in this Italian restaurant, and all the waiters are speaking Italian. Everything's really cool. It's really good Italian food. And they want to take pictures of you with the Italian waiters. That's kind of nice, And then we went to this coffee shop. It's supposed to be a real famous one. And the thing that spooked me, we're sitting there having coffee and this fancy pastry. And then he's got three guys walk in with these three-piece suits, walking to the back of the coffee shop. Closed door. Then they walk out about 15 minutes later. And you're like, did I just see that or not? I mean, is this like The Sopranos, But no one's really bothered because it's in a certain space. The numbers are small. You see? So no one's bothered. There isn't a number that's triggered the fear yet. Okay? So what you have in any culture is that there is some kind of magical point where the number triggers fear. And you see it in Egypt. Something triggered. What that number was, we don't know. See, people here aren't afraid of the Chinese, but the Hispanics, there's millions of them, and they're everywhere. Got to control the numbers. Well, go to Exodus chapter 1. You see the same thing. The first thing they got to do is control the population. And their idea is, okay, we're going to kill the baby boys, which is kind of stupid because you're going to be killing the future labor force that you're using. Then what they do is they say, okay, you can make bricks, but without straw. Well, that's a really good decision because that actually makes the bricks better, and you're building Egyptian buildings. So not only are you going to make it harder for them to make bricks, you're going to have worse bricks for your buildings. But then you begin to think about U.S. work laws. See, we're going to do E-Verify, and we're going to make it harder for them to get a job, and we're going to fine the employer, and we're going to... But we need them for our farms, to harvest our tomatoes. We need them on our ranches. We need them to be cleaning the dishes and to be cutting the grass and to doing construction. And so there it is. Labor. The other thing that you see is justice, because what these verses will tell you is that the law is the same. The penalties are the same, both for the native born and for the foreigner. Because what's the fear of the one from the outside? The system is not fair. I mean, that's the natural thought, right? And oftentimes that is the truth. But the Old Testament law says no, the same penalties for both. The issue of food. There are certain laws that allow them to glean the fields. This is the story of Ruth. There's a special tithe every 3 years of food to take care of the widow and the orphan and the poor and the one from the outside. Inclusion in worship, and this is amazing. The most precious part of the identity of ancient Israel was themselves as a worshiping community. And they're willing to open the door to the thing that's most precious to them to allow them to come in. And then to love your neighbor, Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19, verse 18 says, love your neighbor as yourself. We kind of know that. Jesus said it, but it actually goes back to Leviticus. And that's in verse 18. But when you get to verses 33 and 34, like you see in your notes, what it says is you will love the foreigner as yourself. And that becomes the ultimate test about who is your neighbor that you are to love. Because the hardest neighbor to love is the one that's different from you. And there it is in Leviticus 19. Work, justice, food, integrating into the culture, attitudes, the love your neighbor piece. But what you also find is there are expectations toward the outsider too. Because if you're going to participate in the worship services, if you're going to participate in a society, one thing you've got to do is kind of learn the language. The other thing, for instance, in Deuteronomy 31, is you have to learn the law. And so what this does, it talks about the periodical gathering together of the whole community, and it gives you the list of people who are supposed to be there, and in that list is the foreigner, so they can hear the law, because that's what they have to learn, how to function in their new land. Now you can see how this echoes into U.S. needs, or any country in the world. Now the question you would ask if you were an Israelite is this: why should I do this? Why should I care for the foreigner and the immigrant? And the law gives them two reasons. They're in your notes. The first reason is historical memory. Because it says this: you shall, never forget. You will remember that once you were slaves in Egypt. Therefore, you see, treat these people well. We kind of pass over that. But the importance of memory. I need to go to the next slide. There we go. Let me talk about that for a second. In this country, we have historical memory, immigrant memories. And we did this in the colloquium, I think, right? What is St. Patrick's Day? What group is that? The Irish. And so we all dress up in green, even if you're not Irish. And then you all drink beer. I mean, that's what St. Patrick's Day is all about, isn't it? Being, in green clothes or wearing at least a green sweater, right? And then drinking beer. That's what it's all about. And you get to Oktoberfest, which is about the Germans, and then we all drink beer. It's all about the beer, right? Columbus Day, the Italians. No beer there. But what you're hearing are immigrant memories, reduced to beer and wearing green. Or what you get are family memories about certain foods. We have this friend down the street, they're from an Italian background. They eat lasagna for Christmas. Does that sound awful or what? So I say, so lasagna, we're Italian, really? Do you speak? No, but it's where we're from. We took a trip there once for 2 weeks. All right. And then you'll get this, I use this example, it's Christmas and we do the apple strudel. Our family's Austrian and it's this family secret, the recipe is, right? And so Aunt Martha makes this and, she's hoping against all hope that the younger generation will learn the recipe and we'll all eat strudel for Christmas. But it's a secret, we can't let anybody else know. And we're Austrian. Really? Yes, we trace our line back to the royal family. Everyone goes back to royalty somehow. Now, what you're hearing is immigrant memory, reduced to food and beer, or the occasional piñata or something. But you see, the very things that God said not to forget are the things that we've forgotten. Because he says, remember that you were slaves. Remember the labor. Remember the exploitation. Remember the racism. Remember all those hard things and what they tried to do to you, to kill your children. Don't ever forget that. Because when you do, you will do the very same thing. And that's what's happened in this country, isn't it? Historical amnesia. And so we have forgotten the Italian slums. And we have forgotten the Irish, backwaters. And we have forgotten, the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we kept them out from 1882 to 1943. And we've idealized Ellis Island and we've forgotten Angel Island. in San Francisco. The loss of historical memory. And we repeat the same attitudes that greeted those of our ancestors. You see the wisdom of God. The second motivation that he gives is this, which is more profound. It's the person and commitment of God himself. Because he says this in Deuteronomy 10. You will love the foreigner because I do. I don't know how much more explicit we can get. Why should we love the immigrant? Because God does. Now why? Because God loves vulnerable people. If you were a Christian and I were to ask you, how did you come to faith? You would give me a story of the moment in your life when you were vulnerable. That moment in your life when you cried out to God in all of your vulnerability. Now, it may have been some kind of existential moment, or it may have been some tragedy in your family, but something drove you to your knees, and because you were vulnerable, you cry out to God, and God loves that. But see, those of us who live in comfort, we don't understand that God also loves those who are socio and economically vulnerable and racially vulnerable. He loves them. And there's another passage that even says, and they will cry out, and if you don't respond, you will pay the consequences. But then he says in Deuteronomy 10, 17 to 19, you will love them because I do, giving them food and clothing. You see, the love of God toward the vulnerable outsider is concrete. And how does God do that? How does God give them food and clothing? Well, this doesn't appear like poof. It doesn't kind of, come down from heaven in kind of divine parachutes. It isn't some kind of lottery ticket that shows up in the mailbox. He gives them food and clothing through his own people. That's how God demonstrates his love toward the outsider, is through his own people. It's a very different kind of discussion, isn't it? Very different world. This is the key, you see. When we think about law and how law shapes the identity of a people, you have to ask, what does immigration law not say about those who are trying to come in? What does immigration law say about us who live here? In our values, in our priorities, in our charitableness, in our compassion. You see, our laws reflect that. And they also will shape a generation that grows up in that. What will present immigration law tell our children about outsiders? Now, whenever you deal with immigration law, and you try to talk about the values and the ethos that a law creates, and you move into this Old Testament world of compassion and of grounding it in the value of this person and caring for the outsider, even as you expect something in return, as I already said. Sooner or later, you've got to get to this, right? Romans 13. Now, as I was saying yesterday, the problem with a lot of people who are Christians is that that's where they want to begin the conversation. The problem with beginning the conversation there is that then it's just a question of if you're legal or not. I mean, that's it. That's the only discussion you have. And depending on your answer, you're either in or you're out, we're done. But what I tried to do yesterday, you see, was to take you through narratives that show you about God's heart for all of these kinds of people. And now what I've tried to do is give you some kind of take on Old Testament law But how does this all work? Well, let's get at it. How do we approach Romans 13? Now, the problem that I have is that, like I said, this is where some people want to begin. They kind of helicopter in. They kind of land, they kind of do the Romans 13, 1-7, and they kind of helicopter out. Okay. Hopefully we're kind of doing the trajectory thing. And what I also find is that there's this assumption that people have that law in this country is inherently good. The other assumption is that the law works. Now, if I were to say, really, have you actually engaged the IRS? Well, it's just a mess, all that bureaucracy. So the law doesn't work. No, it works. We're under the rule of law. But you just told me the IRS kind of messes you around. Well, it's just, you got to trust in the government. My mother died in January. So we're working through all the inheritance and all that kind of probate, and it's complicated. Then you try to phone Social Security, right? Then they lose things. I was talking to AARP, which works with Medicare and dealing with my mother's medical bills, and so I phoned over a 3-4 month time, 4 different times for this one form. Yes, hello. And I kind of explained, well, give me your mother's number. Okay. Well, we can't find her in the system. What do you mean? I have your card in front of me. Well, what's the name on the card? Well, we can't find her name. I said, I have your card in front of me. Well, what's her birthday? And so, we found, oh, yes, we have found her. We've been going on for like 15, 20 minutes. And I said, so, I'm the executor of the estate, and I need to do this and that. And they said, well, we can't talk to you. But you are talking to me. No, we can't. I can't tell you anymore until you fill out a form and send that to us. Okay, let me give you my address. Fine. It's in the mail today. In fact, as I'm speaking to you, we are printing it out. Wonderful. A month later, hasn't come. Get somebody else. So what's her number? We don't have her in the system. I just talked to you a month ago, and I have the card in front of me. Well, what's her name? Tell. Oh, well, we don't have her. When's her birthday? Oh, yes, we have found her. Right. Have you ever seen the show Faulty Towers? Have you ever seen Faulty Towers? You need to. This is a Faulty Towers moment. So I said, I need to ask some questions. We can't talk to you because we need the form. I said, I know I never got the form. Can you just believe me? No, we need the form. What is your address? I gave you my address. We have no record of your address. I said, oh, let me give it to you one more time. And then they say, as we are speaking, we are printing it out. It will go out in the mail today. Thank you. A month goes by. So what's her number? We don't have her in the system. What's her name? We don't have her in the system. What's her birthday? Oh, yes, we have found her. I need to talk to... We can't do that without the form. I said, can you fax me the form? And I will fax it to you today. We don't do that here. It goes by regular mail. Can I talk to your supervisor, please? By the 4th time, I got the form. I sent it in. I waited 2 weeks and I phoned again. We don't have her number. And I went through the whole thing again. Oh, yes, I have found her. I know you have because I've talked to you 4 times. And I'm trying to get this straightened out. So what are you insinuating about our program? I said, I just want help. Can I talk to your supervisor? Finally, after 3 months, we got it. Now, all of us have these precious moments in time where the law doesn't work and we live here. Why is the working assumption that immigration law works? Because it doesn't. Why is the working assumption that immigration law is good? If you tell me that, you've just told me two things. One is you don't know immigration law, and you don't know the history of immigration law. And then when we read it, we misread it because it says, we should submit to the authorities. It doesn't say we have to obey them. Now, the problem is we begin reading Romans 13 at Romans 13:1. Wrong place to start. When you go to Romans, and just begin in chapter 1. Chapters 1 through 3 will tell us the extent of human sin. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God. You know how that works. Chapter 4 then begins to tell us how we can respond in faith to God in Christ and get beyond the condemnation. Now, some will think, so if I do come to faith, I can do whatever I want. Romans chapter 6. The answer is no, that's not true. But it is hard, because there's always this internal battle. Romans chapter 7. But even so, the beginning of Romans chapter 8, there is now no condemnation for those who believe in Christ Jesus. But the Christian life is hard. In fact, part of it is being molded into the image of Christ, and that will come through suffering, it tells us in Romans chapter 8. And then the question is, what about the Jews and all of this? And that gives us Romans 9 to 11, which crescendos with this long doxology. Then it moves into Romans chapter 12, where actually we should begin to read to get to Romans 13. And Romans 12 begins by saying we shouldn't, be molded into the world, but we should, give ourselves as a living sacrifice to God. And you know how this works, right? You know the passage? You're at Fuller? You can nod, or some of you are still kind of looking at me. Romans, where's Romans? But you see, what happens is when we talk about Romans chapter 12 and not being molded into the world, we normally think of like doing drugs and porn. Okay, I get that. But if you keep reading on in Romans chapter 12, it talks about the spiritual gifts through which we are empowered to serve other people. See, that's kind of out of what the world does. And then it talks about, as far as it is, you are able, be at peace with all people. That's kind of out of line with what the world does, isn't it? And then what it says, it talks about your enemies. And if your enemy is hungry, you give them something to eat. And if your enemy is thirsty, you give them something to drink. Boy, that is really out of what the world does. You see, part of the shaping of our minds is not only the actions, it's our ideology. Our ideology, vis-a-vis the foreigner, is part of being molded into the world. Has society defined for us how we look at the outsider? That's being shaped by the world and the enemy. And I tell people, even if you are threatened by immigrants and you see them as the enemy of this country, you are to feed them. You are to give them something to drink. If you are a Christian and you take them as your enemy, you have no excuse. And now when you get to Romans 13, it's talking about the government. It's not talking about the Christian church. And I respect the government. I appreciate its laws, and I will submit to them as far as my conscience will allow. But they will not define for me how I look at immigrants. See, it's not about the Christian church there totally. It's not about doing what the government says and assuming it's true and right. And when I hear people, and I used this earlier today, and again, it all kind of runs together. I can't remember when I did it. But it wasn't tonight. People talk about the rule of law. And I'll go, okay, you want the rule of law? Let's talk about Birmingham, Alabama in 1960. And you see the film clips of policemen with dogs holding them back as they jump at African Americans. And see them turning the water hoses on the crowds. And the police beating them with clubs and putting them in jail. You see, all under the rule of law. Do you really want that rule of law? And let's go back another 100 years in Birmingham in 1860, before the Civil War. Do you really want the rule of law then? You see, it's not the rule of law, full stop. It's what are the laws? And they may be totally wrong. And that's why you work to change them. And if you know U.S. immigration law, the first thing you know, it's not static, that it's changing. Both parties know they have to change it. Everyone is waiting for the change. So it makes even less sense to just assume that it's good and it's true. As Christians, we would have to redefine the whole conversation. And my time is up, and this is where I end. Is now we can move into a discussion of immigration legislation reform. A different set of values, a different moral compass, a different direction, and a different tone. And now it becomes an ethical imperative and a missional challenge to work for immigration reform.